Hello everyone, I'm Aileen Carroll, sommelier with Lynfred Winery. Thank you all so much for joining us for this summer installment of our virtual guided tasting series featuring our delicious Vignol. Vignol is a very unique grape. It's actually a hybrid of French and American species, so there's going to be so many interesting and complex flavors to these wines that we have. Today we are featuring these wines in a vertical tasting, meaning we get to compare 3 different vintages, and the interesting thing is going to be that even though we have the same type of grape in all these wines, they're made in slightly different ways, ranging from dry to what we call off dry. We'll have a chance to get clear on exactly what these terms mean. We'll learn about the winemaking process for achieving different levels of sweetness in wine. I'll have some tips and tricks for how you can expand your skills in tasting wine. And of course, I'll be offering some excellent food and wine pairing suggestions for you. Sound good? Let's get started. Now, before we taste the wine, I do want to explain that there are 3 different factors that contribute to how a wine tastes. First, of course, we have the grape itself with all of its unique inherent aromas, flavors, and characteristics. So, since we have the same grape here today, obviously any of the differences that we're going to be tasting aren't coming from differences in types of grape. Secondly, the main thing that contributes to how a wine tastes is where the specific grapes that make the wine are grown. For example, there's a big difference between what a Sauvignon Blanc made from grapes grown in warm, sunny California tastes like versus a Sauvignon Blanc made from grapes grown in cooler, less sunny France. So growing conditions do have an effect on how a wine turns out. But the Vignol grapes featured in these 3 wines today are all grown in exactly the same vineyard in Michigan. So any differences we're tasting aren't going to be coming from where the grapes are grown. The differences we'll taste come from the 3rd and final factor that affects how a wine tastes, and those are all of the winemaking choices. For example, a Chardonnay that is grown in the same place can taste different depending on if a winemaker chooses to use oak or not to use oak. As a second, more relevant example, not all Rieslings are sweet. Some can be made dry. It just has to do with how the winemaker processes the wine. So the reason that I bring this up is because sometimes people will encounter a wine made from a certain grape and they don't like that particular version of that wine, and then they'll conclude, I don't like Chardonnay, for example. But as I said, there's a big difference in how a certain grape can taste in a wine based on how it's treated. And the cool thing about understanding these different factors, it'll allow you to better hone in on exactly what it is that you like and why you like it. And then when you know that, you can go find other similar wines that will also be delicious for you. So to understand the specific winemaking differences that we have between these vintages of Vignol, there's a technical term that I want us to get clear on because it does tend to get used a little bit ambiguously, and that term is dry. All that the term dry means is that a wine doesn't taste sweet. That's it. But the term dry can be a little bit confusing. Specifically, it gets confused with the term tannin, because tannin is that aspect of a wine that makes your mouth feel dry. Now, we actually don't have to worry about understanding tannin today because there's virtually no tannin at all in white wine. Well, how could that be, you ask? Good question. There's a big difference between how white wine and red wine is made, and that's whether or not the skins of the grape are included in the fermentation process, because the skin is where the tannins are. Now, to make a red wine, you take the grapes, squish them with the skins on, and then you ferment that whole thing, the skins and the juice. But with white wine, you press the grapes, get just the juice, and ferment only the juice without the skins and turn that into wine. So back to the term dry. It just means not sweet, and off dry just means slightly sweet. The interesting and important thing is that the level of sweetness doesn't have anything to do with the grape itself, but from the way in which the wine is made. So I already explained that white wine is made by pressing the juice, leaving the skins behind, adding yeast, and then you ferment that juice into wine because the yeast will eat the sugars and convert those into alcohol. A winemaker can choose to stop that fermentation process before it's fully complete, before the yeast has eaten all the sugar. They do this by chilling the wine to a temperature below which the yeast can't operate, and then they filter the yeast out. So since the yeast hasn't eaten quite all of the sugar yet, there will be some residual sugar remaining in the wine, meaning that the wine will taste a little bit sweeter than if the fermentation process had been allowed to go to completion. Now, if a winemaker wants to make a slightly sweet wine, they have to decide exactly when to stop the fermentation process, depending on how much residual sugar they want to leave in the wine. So that's the process by which we get varying levels of sweetness from the exact same grape. For the 2015 Vignol that we are going to start with in just a moment, the fermentation process was allowed to go essentially until completion, leaving almost no residual sugar whatsoever, resulting in a very dry, not sweet wine. The 2014 was stopped just prior to the completion of fermentation, meaning we have a very slight amount of residual sugar, precisely 0.6%, and then the 2017 is done in that off-dry, slightly sweet style with a remaining residual sugar of exactly 1%. So now that I've gotten all of these technical explanations out of the way, let's have some wine. We're going to start with the 2015 Vignol. So we can go in order from most dry to least dry. And I'll be giving some tips and tricks on how to expand your tasting skills along the way. Of course, first we want to swirl and smell. And the reason that we swirl is to allow a little bit of the wine to evaporate in the glass so that we're better able to smell all the delicious and subtle aromas. Oh, also in case no one ever told you, the reason that we hold the wine by the stem is to make sure we appear very sophisticated. Actually, I'm kidding. There is a really good reason for why we hold wines by the stem. It's even more important with white wines because obviously they're served at colder temperatures than red wines. The reason you want to hold it from the stem is so that your natural body heat doesn't accidentally warm up the wine in your glass. I mentioned white wine should be served colder. Specifically, sparkling whites should be served at about 40 degrees. Light body whites like Pinot Grigio and Sauvignon Blanc should be served between 40 and 45 degrees. And any medium to full body white wine, like an oaky Chardonnay, for example, should be served between 45 and 55 degrees actually. Our Vignol is a medium body white wine, so 45 to 55 degrees is ideal, but on a hot summer day, I honestly like any of my white wines like as cold as possible, but I do have to draw the line somewhere. Please don't put ice cubes in your wine. It really will dilute the flavors and the aromas. So when investigating the aromas of a white wine, it's easiest to just ask your imagination a couple of different categories of what you might be smelling or tasting. Mainly fruit, flowers, and herbs too, if you're feeling ambitious. In our 2015 Vignol, I'm getting mostly lemon, as well as yellow apple, and a lot of pineapple, as well as a bit of yellow flowers, but I'm keeping all that short because I want a sip of this wine as much as you do. Cheers. Dry white wines are so refreshing in the heat of summer. Now, remembering our terms from before, this wine is obviously dry because it doesn't taste sweet, but there's one other technically different aspect of this wine that I'm sure we're also noticing right away, and that's how mouth-watering, tart, and refreshing it is. So I do want to briefly explain that other technical term now that we finally quenched our thirst, and that term is acid, which can sound a little bit scary or unappetizing, but it's an important wine term to get clear on. Acidity is exactly that thirst-quenching, refreshing texture that we were noticing right away in this 2015. It's that textural aspect that makes your mouth water. I know, I'm sure most of our mouths water at the thought of any wine, but in all seriousness, think of how different in texture this is from, for example, a rich oaky Chardonnay. Chardonnay is smooth, it's not tart, it's not acidic, whereas this is acidic. Now you may think that any acidic white wine is also dry by definition, but we'll see today that's actually not the case. With the sweeter 2017 vintage that we have, you'll see that there can actually be a dry white wine that's not acidic but is instead sweet, and in fact there'll be this amazing balance between sweetness and acidity that I can't wait for us to taste. So let's move on through these. We're going to use that same imagination jogging framework of thinking if we can think of any fruit flavors, then any herbal, and then any floral aspects as well. So you can even break down the fruit categories into more specific categories to get your imagination going and improve your tasting skills. With white wines, there's usually a citrus component, an apple or pear component, and a tropical component sometimes as well. So we'll go in order and see which of those notes we can pick out. Definitely tasting lemon as well as apple. And then extra points if you push your imagination further and ask about the color as well as the character of that fruit. So what kind of apple am I tasting? I want to say golden delicious. And then slightly similar to that apple flavor, I was also picking up a little bit of apricot notes. And then for the tropical, definitely tasting that pineapple. And even more extra points if you ask your imagination about how ripe any specific fruit that you're tasting is. So is the pineapple component tart and unripe? Is it ripe and juicy? Or is it almost overripe and baked tasting? I'd say tart and unripe to juicy and ripe, but again, it's so mouth-watering. So I think that covers the fruit tastes pretty well. So are we tasting any floral aspects next? Wow. Focus on that almost kind of thick and slightly sweet seeming yellow flower quality. That's honeysuckle. Now I say that like I've eaten a lot of honeysuckle flowers and am therefore quite confident in what it tastes like, but I haven't eaten any honeysuckle flowers. As you may or may not know though, 90% of what we think we taste is actually sensory information derived from what we are smelling. Even though I've never eaten a honeysuckle, I have smelled them, and thus, according to science, I am 90% sure of what a honeysuckle flower tastes like, and it tastes like this. Likewise with grass, which I have never eaten but have smelled. I'm getting almost like a sweetgrass taste here in terms of herbal elements. One tip for you as you expand your smelling and tasting skills besides stopping and smelling the flowers is to not be too hard on yourself or worry that you're going to give the wrong answer when you say what you're tasting or smelling. It's really an art as well as a science, and luckily enough for us, practice makes perfect. We're going to try the 2014 next, because when you're doing a flight of wine, it is best to go from the most dry to the least dry, because if you were to start with the sweet wine, your palate would get kind of overwhelmed and you wouldn't be able to pick up on the more subtle flavors coming from the dry wines later. As I mentioned before, there is ever so slightly more residual sugar in the 2014 versus the 2015, so we can expect to have a little bit of a sweeter taste. But we're going to start with the nose. In case no one ever told you what that means, when we say the nose of the wine, that's just a sophisticated way of saying what it smells like. And when we say the palate of the wine, again, just a sophisticated way of saying what it tastes like. So, pinkies up. Okay, so that floral quality I mentioned in the other wine, that honeysuckle is really coming through on the nose of this. Also, I want to say yellow pear, or even more specifically Anjou pear for extra fanciness. And for other fruit flavors, aromas, I'd say kind of a baked melon and some overripe pineapple. Before we taste it, I want you to see if you can hone in on one really distinctive aroma of this 2014 vintage. It's an herbal one. It's specifically the most expensive herb in the world. I'll give you a clue. If you've ever had French style mussels in broth, you know the broth is a little bit reddish and it has this weird but delicious kind of iron-like flower character to it. That's saffron, and I'm definitely smelling it here. I think you'll be able to pick it up more when we taste it. Yay. Wow, that's pretty amazing. So first, I think the honeysuckle aspect is coming across the most. If you weren't picking it out too much in the 2015 vintage, it's definitely coming out here. Besides that honeysuckle, I do taste the Anjou pear and the pineapple that we were smelling. And when you get past those floral and fruit aspects, see if you can hone in on that kind of iron-like or reddish taste to help out your imagination. That's the taste of saffron as well as the honeysuckle. So it's interesting that even though we can taste that this wine is ever so slightly sweeter than the first, there's still definitely a refreshing, mouth-watering tartness or acidity to it. So I'd say this wine is an excellent balance of sweetness and acidity. And those fruit and herbal flavors are so complex and interesting. Part of the reason for these flavors being so unique is that the Vignol grape is a unique hybrid between French and American grape species. Almost every single wine grape that we're used to is technically a French species of grape. Even further technically, they're all the same species of grape. Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, all technically the same French species. But if that's confusing, just think of all dogs are the same species, but there's different breeds. Here though, we've got something even more complicated. It's a hybrid, meaning along with that French grape, somewhere in the genetic line, it got mixed with uniquely American grapes, and Vignol was the result. But mysteriously, no one's exactly sure which American species blended with the French species and are the parents of this Vignol, but what I am sure of, because I have the winemaker's notes on all these wines, is that this particular vintage isn't 100% Vignol like the rest of them. It is 20% Riesling. So because we have this unique Vignol grape, because there's a little bit of Riesling in there, that's why we're getting just this really interesting and complex bouquet of flavors and aromas in the 2014 here. Concluding our tasting with the 2017 vintage, which is 100% Vignol. This one though is done in a sweeter or off-dry style, which as we know just means a little bit sweet. Now, I mentioned that the variations in sweetness come from the winemaker's decision as to when to stop the fermentation process and how much residual sugar to maintain in the wine. The thing that helps them decide is that balance of sweetness and acidity that I briefly mentioned. We'll see when we taste this one how amazingly harmonious the elements of sweet and tart are. Serious kudos to Andres and Rodrigo, our winemakers, on this particular vintage, and of course all of them. But in terms of showcasing winemaking techniques when it comes to sweet wine, this 2017 is really going to be a treat. Okay, enough talk, let's smell so that we can taste. I mean, let's investigate the nose. So starting with fruit, definitely lemon, yellow apple, and pineapple. Those fruits seem to be pretty characteristic of the Vignol grape, but I think the tropical elements are the most predominant in this vintage, and I want to say there's even a bit of a unripe banana too, as well as some greenery like palm leaves, I want to say. Cheers. Oh my goodness, that's so interesting, right? So there's definitely like this zesty lemon, but it has like a candied aspect to it at the same time. That's that balance of sweetness and acidity. Wow. Also, Those tropical pineapple and banana bits. I'm getting some pear here on the palate that I didn't quite pick up on the nose. Ask your imagination what color the pear is and how ripe it is. I'd say like a baked yellow pear, baked on the pineapple as well. Also apple, specifically green apple, but mostly I'm just blown away by how we have such harmony between the sweet aspects and the tart aspects of this 2017 vintage. Really, really well done and cool. Now I do want to point out that even though I've been talking in terms of a couple of objective aspects that go into a good wine, like a balance of sweetness and acidity, there is so much room for subjectivity and personal taste, and I really always like to highlight that. There's definitely no right or wrong answer as to whether or not you prefer the drier 2015 or the off-dry 2017. The cool thing about learning about wine, as I mentioned before, is that it gives you the tools to understand exactly why you like what you like, and then once you know that, you can go find more delicious wine to try. So if you liked the off-dry 2017, and now you know what that term means, if you ever see it on a wine label, you can go ahead and give that wine a try. You might like it. Or maybe you thought that the 2015 was better, but maybe you thought before that the term dry referred to that potentially unpleasant characteristic that some red wines have where they dry your mouth out. But now that you know what dry really means, if you know you like the 2015, the next time you get to go to a restaurant, you can ask your server to suggest a dry white wine for you. All right, so we've been talking a lot about the different levels of sweetness in wine as well as acidity. So I do want to finish by talking about how different levels of sweetness and acidity work when pairing food with wine. Just like we wanted a balance between acidity and sweetness in the wine itself, we'll also want to balance sweet and spicy when it comes to pairing wine with food. Off-dry or sweeter wines like our 2017 are fantastic matches for any kind of spicy cuisine. So think spicy Asian food, Thai food, Korean barbecue. The thing that sweet or off-dry wine does is, objectively, this is a fact, a sweet wine will kind of cut through the spiciness of food and in that way create balance. Even though that is objectively true, that circles me right back to the subjective elements of food and wine pairing. Maybe you really, really, really like spicy food. Maybe you like it so much that you don't want to create balance in your pairing. You don't want a slightly sweet wine to soften the spiciness of the food. Maybe you want a wine that will actually increase how spicy your food is. We can make that happen. So the opposite of how sweet wine balances out spicy food is that a more acidic white wine will actually make spicy food taste spicier. So it's up to you which direction you want to go with these objective food and wine pairing principles. Another interesting subjective choice in direction when it comes to pairing wine and food is whether you want to go with a congruent or a complementary flavor pairing. Congruent just means matching, like similar flavors with similar flavors, whereas complementary means opposite but highlighting. Think of how like red and green are complementary colors, so they're opposite, but they like make the other one stand out even more. Let's use the 2014 as an example of these different styles of flavor pairing. So the standout flavors were honeysuckle, saffron, and tropical fruit. Had to sneak a sip in there. If we wanted to do a congruent or matching food pairing, we could pair it with those French style mussels in a saffron broth that I mentioned because the saffron matches the saffron. The fruit flavors that we have are more on the tropical end of the spectrum. So if we wanted to do a complementary or contrasting pairing, we could maybe pair it with like a lemon garlic shrimp or a lemon chicken, because the lemon is a little more on the citrus end, which is kind of the opposite of the tropical flavors that are here. So that would create a kind of interesting juxtaposition. Just like tasting wine is very much of an art, so too is food and wine pairing. It's very much about whatever you like, but as we've been seeing, there are some objective parts to it too. So just to recap, the objective principles that we mentioned were that sweeter wine softens or balances spicy food, whereas a more acidic wine will actually increase your perception of the spiciness of the food. And the subjective part is that you get to decide which principle you want to use, whether you want a pairing that makes the spicy food spicier or less spicy. It's up to you to decide whether you want a congruent or a complementary pairing. So let's play a quick little game applying those pairing principles that we learned, focusing on the sweeter 2017 and the more dry 2015. If you have a spicy dish and you really like spicy food and you want it to taste as spicy as possible, which of these two wines would you want to go with? That's right, obviously the 2015, because the acidity in this particular vintage will make the food taste even spicier. And if you've got that same spicy dish but you do want to soften the spice a little bit, which of our wines should you pair it with? Obviously the off-dry 2017, because that slight amount of residual sugar that remains because of the choice to stop the fermentation process before full completion results in a slightly spicy wine, and that a slightly sweet wine that will balance out the spiciness of the food. Now, I really like this example because it shows how there's a balance of objectivity and subjectivity when it comes to wine. Objectively, sweet balances spicy and acidity increases spice, but it's up to you subjectively to decide whether you want your spice balanced or heightened. Likewise, objectively, it's good for there to be a balance between sweetness and acidity within the wines themselves, but it's up to you subjectively to decide whether you like it a bit more on the dry end of the spectrum or a bit more on the sweet side of the spectrum. It's all about what you enjoy, and I really hope that you did learn a few things from this guided tasting video that'll allow you to go out and search and discover more wines that you enjoy. I know we covered a lot of ground, but now you know the 3 factors that affect how a wine tastes. You know how white wine is made, you know how different levels of sweetness in wine are created through winemaking choices, and you've got some excellent food and wine pairing principles to experiment with. If you're interested in learning more through our virtual guided tasting series, we do have one other summer installment video available for you now, featuring our Saval Blanc, which is another really interesting French-American hybrid. To stay updated on more virtual guided tasting videos that are going to be available, and to discover more amazing wines, just check out our website, lynfredwinery.com. Until next time, cheers!